Hey guys, welcome to the Talking It Out podcast, and we're going to be talking about all things sex, love, singleness, and walking with Jesus as a young adult in today's world. Hi, my name is Nathaniel.
And I'm Brielle.
And today we have a special episode. I'm here with one of my great friends, one of my best friends, Matthias Barker, the one and only. You may have seen his video floating around the social medias because the guy's gifted with words. He's gifted with connecting with folks. Just a really special person. You are a psychotherapist, therapist?
Psychotherapist, counselor, kind of interchangeable. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here. Happy to talk.
Glad to have you. I mean, I'm excited to have a conversation. I mean, you heard the tagline. We're going to be talking about some fun stuff.
Come on. Let's do it.
And I'm really curious on your insight and your experience. And I'm excited.
Yeah, me too.
So Matthias, who are you?
Like you said, psychotherapist, counselor, and I'm in Spokane, Washington. I have a clinical practice here. I have a family. We just had a little girl 6 months ago. And so, for those listening, maybe either coming over from my channel or maybe you know me. Me and Nate, one of the hosts here on this podcast, we've been friends for like 9 years. So this is going to be a hoot. We're gonna be talking. We've had all these conversations over and over around, just sexual ethics, how to move towards Jesus, and that's going to be fun. I'm really happy to be here, man. But that's who I am. I'm a counselor. I just try to help people move towards what's meaningful in hardship. That's kind of my tagline. That's how I summarize it.
Yeah. I love it.
Matthias, I have questions for you because here you guys are. You guys are buddies, pals, but I've never met you in person, and I kind of feel like I'm third wheeling on this bromance. So I would just love to know a little bit more about you. I'm also a psychotherapist or counselor here in Washington State as well.
Awesome.
And so it'd be fun in this conversation to pick your brain and understand your perspective, your opinions, and all the stuff that you see. I imagine, I specifically work with women, so I imagine you see different things, maybe not, coming from, because I know, don't you work with couples and men and women and youth, and so you see a lot of maybe different perspective than I do.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I work with a pretty even amount of men and women, and then a lot of couples,
Okay.
So, it's been a great kind of just shift even in my career, just to kind of move over to doing a lot more couples work too. Just in the past year, that's been really engaging.
Yeah,
so it's one thing to kind of see these dynamics play out just for individuals and just kind of how each person's interpreting things when it comes to sexuality, or trying to connect to people. It's a whole other ball game when everyone's in the room and you kind of have both stories. I don't know. I'm sure you could relate to that as a therapist.
Yeah.
It's a whole different
I imagine.
ballgame.
So for you, can you tell us, can you highlight the importance of acknowledging and working through your own mental health, specifically as it relates to singleness, dating, isolation? What have you seen recently in the past year and a half with some of your clients?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of things are very circumstantial because I think, like you bring up isolation and kind of just how this pandemic and lockdowns, quarantine has affected people. It really does depend on kind of the circumstances around that. A lot of my clients, like, for example, who are like 11, 12, 13, the conversation with parents has been like, gosh, they're so lonely. They can't, just kind of run around with their friends and wrestle and do sleepovers like they used to. And then they're either just, I work with a lot of younger boys in particular, but, they're just on Xbox Live with their friends. Is there anything else we can do? Like, it just seems like that's the only way they can connect. It's the only way that they can, kind of bridge that gap. Or just like school at home has been really challenging. And so a lot of parents are excited to kind of get back in school because, I don't know, a lot of my clients are single moms and trying to figure out childcare and work their job and do homeschool for their kid. It's been super challenging. And so that's one dynamic. But also, I think with people who are just single and living by themselves, they found profound loneliness and had to come up with new strategies of ways to find that connection with people. Yeah. People who are married, I saw things either get way better or way worse. Like there was no one that was like in between. There was no one that just kind of coasted. I guess, I don't know, if they're in therapy, maybe that's because they're having a hard time anyway. But something about being trapped in the same house just kind of forced people to, I don't know, address what was going on, address the elephants in the room. And that was either a good thing or made things way harder. So I think that, it really does kind of depend circumstantially on each person. General themes, I think that a lot of us really took our mental health a lot more seriously. Just because being alone, being in isolation really did kind of present an opportunity to be alone with our own thoughts. And I think that there's a certain kind of way in interacting in the world where you can have just a lot of background noise moving around, and you can have a lot of just busyness that kind of coats over the complexities or the things that are feeling unaddressed. And so when you strip away that busyness, when you strip away that activity, and then you're just in a room by yourself, it's like you either find new busyness, which is totally doable. You can just, binge watch your favorite show, or you can be on your phone like crazy. But I don't know, other people, they realized there was a lot of stuff that maybe they need to be paying attention to. And so it came to the surface. And yeah, I don't know the actual stats, but it felt like when I was talking to other counselors in our area, it was like everyone's wait list just blew up. Everyone, it's like, I don't know, this is probably an exaggerated number, but it felt like there's maybe 10,000, 5,000 therapists in Spokane, Washington, and there's like 100,000 people looking for counseling. That's how it feels. It's just,
right.
And we can't get to everybody. And everyone that I talk to is like, I've tried to reach out to like 3 or 4 therapists. They all have wait lists that are like 3 months long. What do I do in the meantime? And so that's been,
I think that's the question. I think that's a very important question. Like, what are people doing in the meantime?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what really inspired me in some regard to be making the videos that I've been making. I make a lot of podcasts and videos on YouTube and TikTok and Instagram on mental health, and specifically like working through trauma and working through conflict. Those are kind of the 2 big topics that I hang out on. So whether that's marital conflict, whether that's conflict with your kid, whether that's conflict with your parents, like, or, working through past trauma and working through things that have happened in your life. I have a lot of training, particularly in sexual trauma. So that comes up pretty often, but it's, I think a big part of the reason maybe I jumped into the public eye in the way that I did at this time was because, I don't know, my theory is people were trying to get into therapy. They're lonely. They don't have a lot of resources. And so they jumped online looking for help. And so a little bit of right place at right time, and trying to do my best to help people any way I can. So yeah, I don't know. Those are some themes that I'm looking at.
I want to shift gears a little bit because last night I was watching a video, what to do if you're struggling with porn. And you open up with the pornography, but what I really appreciated what you did was you went into developing your own sexual ethic. And you have this kind of encouragement like, hey, I think you should come up with your own sexual ethic to understand how you interact with pornography and understand maybe the reasons why you'd run to pornography. You've emphasized sexual ethic in a lot of your videos. Going back, what is the importance of developing your own sexual ethic? Like how do you see that play out in kind of the everyday life of, 20 of your friend in New York who only walks his dog, but maybe wants to start dating and hops on Tinder or is going to church and finding that he's attractive to someone at church, something like that. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. The way that I phrase it in the video, and this is really just kind of inspired out of my clinical practice, was I'm working with non-Christians in particular. I have a few Christian clients, but I don't advertise myself as a Christian therapist or anything. And so the question is like, how do you mitigate the negatives and, expand on the positives when it comes to sexuality and the way that you're organizing your sexuality in your life? And so that's a universal human question, that has, Christendom has its own answers to that, but there's universal, you can almost have some universal right answers and some universal wrong answers. We can all agree on some things, so what I kind of tackled in that podcast YouTube video was just like, okay, what if the agreed upon line that no one crosses in our culture today is consent. Like that's, if we're going to agree on anything, we probably shouldn't engage sexually with people who don't give consent. And so that includes both, sexual assault and, engaging with a child. And so my question in that video was, does it go anywhere beyond that? Does that mitigate all the negatives that could come about when engaging sexually with somebody? Does that promote all the positives? Is that really all we got? Is make sure they're not like, I don't know, make sure they're giving you consent. So that doesn't, to me, feel like a very compelling roadmap for a flourishing sexual life to engage other people in a way that actually expands, not just the intimacy that you have with that person, but your own personal well-being. And so, yeah, I think I was just kind of in that video giving people the imperative that you should develop something like that. And I shared a little bit of mine, because I'm Christian. And so I believe that, hey, you should be compassionate and actually look at how this sexual experience is impacting the other person, and just have like a real personal, almost moment of honesty of, is this sexual experience going to end in their long-term flourishing? So beyond just the momentary pleasure, beyond, well, they said yes, and I said yes, giving a little bit of thought to the long-term ramifications of engaging with this person might be a helpful thought exercise. And we're not even in the realm of like moral conversation there. It's almost just highly pragmatic, just to be like, okay, I met this person at a bar. We're both pretty kind of, I don't know, tipsy, and we're probably sober enough to give consent. Like, is that really all there is? like maybe there's something deeper to connecting sexually than just a physical interaction, and maybe that interaction has ramifications on my mental health, their mental health, my emotional health, their emotional health. So that's like in a small pocket what I was saying in that video.
Yeah, but how would you respond to someone where sex is just sex? It's just this carnal desire that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And why are you adding so much meaning to this, right?
Yeah.
Because like, what is to prevent me from, hey, I'm really attracted to someone, I know they're attracted to me,
Mm-hmm.
and just like, let's have a little bit of fun. You know, like, we don't need to make this a big thing. This is just consensual play for adults. Like, why does it have to be consensual deepness?
Yeah.
Or, you know.
Yeah. Well, my response to that, I mean, generally in clinical practice, it's good just to know I'm not over here trying to convince people of these sexual ethics. And I really like whatever people are walking in with, I'm happy just to work with. And I don't want it to come off just like, hey, you should feel bad for wanting to engage sexually with people, and whatever experiences that you've had in the past, you should feel really bad about. I think that can be harmful. But here's maybe the piece that I would say in response to something like that would be, man, I work as a sexual abuse therapist, you know, most prominently, and the greatest wounds we have are sexual wounds. That's what I've seen just universally. And even when you don't want emotions to be evolved, even when you want it to just be a completely emotion-free, connection-free, bonding-free experience, it still has an emotional impact on you. And there's just something different between a sexual assault and getting mugged. Both are a violation of consent, and both, I don't know, both harm your body, but one's different. And one sticks with you.
Yeah.
I don't know, people go to counseling to work through a mugging. Like, that can be a traumatic experience, but I don't know, 50, 60 years down the road, you have people coming in talking about a sexual assault that happened when they were 9. And it's been deeply impacting every decision they made their entire lives. And so my thought is, the sexual experiences that we have, even when we don't want them to be emotionally significant, we just want them to be almost kind of, I don't know, carefree and just fun. They still do something in our hearts and in our minds and in our psyche that we're not always in control of. And so I think that's, I don't know, also being a clinician sitting with people who live that lifestyle for several years, it's not an uncommon experience for people to kind of look back on that and be like, gosh, I'm not sure all that was the best decision for me. Not even on a moral level, not just because, oh, I think it was bad or dirty or something. Just like practically that actually led to a lot of confusion and heartbreak and probably a lot of stress at least. And so that's maybe just an underpinning idea that I think deserves some attention. Yeah.
There is a pragmatism to sex that I feel like is often unspoken when it comes to the church. Like, it's very, here's what you should be doing. If you're not doing this, live in repentance. And kind of take a bath in shame and and wipe yourself off with the glory of God. Like,
that's great. That's so funny.
And I think my vision for the church is to see us having healthier conversations around this.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, you see this, Brielle sees this. I've seen this in youth ministry, just the pain that comes with just seeing the man behind the curtain of just being like, man, they told me that sex was going to ruin my life. They told me that sex was the worst thing that I can do as a Christian, as a young female, as a young male to engage in sexual activity. I just experienced sex for the first time. It was great. And because I was told, you know, that sex was this monster that I had to, you know, watch out for, I'm like, man, sex is my best friend right now. Sex makes me feel great. And I think that puts us into a point where, like, we may be able to, where we question some of those values that or maybe imparted upon us, or maybe we were indoctrinated with, or because the conversation was maybe mishandled previously in the past. It kind of sets us up for failure in the future.
Yeah, it sets up the people that we're trying to like convince by that. Like you're saying it perfectly. That's the effect of shame. It's like in the short term, it'll really motivate you. But then you have sex with your girlfriend or boyfriend. You're like, hey, that was actually kind of nice, and I'm kind of enjoying it. Maybe even break up with them, and it sucks, but you're fine. Like you're okay. That wasn't like a trauma. It wasn't something terrible. And you're like, why all the like prohibitions and weird like taboos around sex? This is actually fun and yeah, okay, yeah, they made the breakup worse or whatever, but whatever. And that's where I think having a more pragmatic and almost kind of rational conversation about
I love it.
helps because it's there's this idea in something called relational frame theory around how you follow a rule and the effect of how you follow a rule having on your psyche. And the two different ways that you can follow a rule is something called pliance, which means I follow this rule because there's social constraints, and I follow this rule because if I don't, I'm going to not be included in my social circle, or it means something bad about me. It's indicative of my identity. Like it's very shame driven. It's very, it's like I don't follow. It for an example could be mom telling me not to touch the stove because mom said so.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it doesn't actually impart any understanding about why touching a stove is bad. It just is like I just don't want to get a punishment from mom. I don't want mom to be mad at me, and so I'm not going to touch the stove. Alternatively, there's a rule that's called tracking in relational frame theory. And that's where I don't touch the stove because I don't want to get burned, and I have an understanding of like why touching the stove could be a bad thing. If Junior grows up and never touches a stove, that's actually a worse quality of life because a stove is actually a really useful tool in the right context, but you need to understand how it's dangerous and why and how it's not dangerous. And if you can have that dynamic, complex understanding of a stove, it'll actually be your friend. It'll cook you meals. So there's, I think sexuality is similar. When we hold to these pliance, kind of ways of enforcing these rules around sexuality in the church, even though they work, I'm not going to touch the stove. I don't want to get smacked by God or by pastor or whatever.
Yeah, lightning.
Yeah, they grew up their whole lives like, what? The stove cooked food? I could have had food this whole time, and they're pissed. Or, the toddler reaches up and touches the stove wasn't on. And we're like, what? Mom's a liar. The stove was fine. And so that's where a dynamic understanding of how the stove's dangerous, how the stove's not, is so much more helpful in this conversation. That's an analogy.
I love that. I'm a big fan of analogies. So I love that. I think it just it just takes and puts in a very practical, easy to understand way when you can put it in that light. Like, why? What is the stove used for? When do we touch it? When do we not? What's it good for? Right. Instead of, I love that a lot. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that analogy. It was awesome.
Question for you, because I know you've talked about this a little bit within your videos. What is the difference between infatuation and love? Right. I've heard you address it a few times.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a biological answer to that question of just, there's a lot of biochemistry that's happening when you're around someone that you're really compatible with and that you feel really engaged with romantically. And so there's a lot of chemicals that are going off in your brain, and I could give you, I guess, like a neurology lesson, but that would be kind of boring. I think you can get the gist that you're really biochemically bonded to this person, and there's actually different parts of your brain, for example, that will downplay the negatives of that person and upplay the positives, and so you're actually looking at that person through a filter. Might be a good way to think about it. Like,
I love that you phrase it that way because of the conversation around sex, right? Because we're talking about the bonding biologically, but go on.
Yeah. So, like for those of us who remember, like, well, I guess they're still there. Like Instagram used to have a bunch of different filters that you could swipe through. They still do. They still do on stories and stuff. But what a photo filter does is it'll raise the brights, it'll lower the darks, it'll add contrast, it'll add saturation. So what it does is it downplays certain parts of the photo and then accentuates other parts of the photo, and that makes it more attractive. And I think our bodies are designed to do that because, I mean, there's a really like adaptive, almost just like evolutionary reason that happens. And that's because if you can really quickly bond, then you procreate faster. And if you procreate faster, there's more humans and you pass along your seed or your genetics, whatever.
Beautiful.
So there's like, the people who had sex faster had more children. And so all of our ancestors were the people who bonded quick and did it quick. And here we are. So it's almost just like a very like pragmatic, thing. If you're trying to survive and propagate the species, is to bond quick and then get going quick, so that's kind of the biological landscape that we're looking at with infatuation is, okay, I actually am a recipient of this genetic strategy that got me here, which is I'm going to bond to this person really intensely. I'm going to actually downplay their negative traits, both in their character or or whatever, in their habits. I'm going to raise the positive traits. And so you should be sober about that. There's an advantage, there's a wisdom in recognizing that as much as you can.
Mm-hmm.
And then trying to involve the community around making a decision of whether you're going to be bonded to this person for the rest of your life, because you need voices and opinions that aren't infatuated to help you understand who that person actually is. And that's super helpful because your judgment is askew in the best way, because you're just stoked about this person. You want to spend 24/7. You want to be around them constantly. You're texting nonstop. You're telling them about your childhood and every opinion you have. You're going to restaurants you don't even like and eating food you don't like, but you're telling them you love it because you just like being with them. And so that's infatuation. And I think, I mean, it's different for everyone, but that infatuation can wear off in 6 months. It can wear off in a year. It can wear off in 3 years. And so, I think what's helpful about infatuation dying off too is that you're forced to reckon with the negative or undeveloped or immature parts of that person's character, or honestly, just the parts of their personality that are different than yours. Not even because they're inferior or bad or anything, but just because they conflict on a personality level. And then you're going to start negotiating, and that's really, really imperative. You're going to have to work together on converging your two life experiences, your two sets of preferences. And the way that you do that is either going to build trust and build intimacy, or it's going to force you to completely segment off these whole parts of your personality and your preferences and these experiences because my experience isn't safe here. So, for example, it would be like, I want to buy a house one day. And then the other person's like, no, I want to live in Manhattan. I want to live in like a studio. Oh, like,
Come on, man, get out of my marriage.
No, I'm talking about my marriage. Yeah, I was like, that was a big argument from me and my wife. It was like, I would just want to live in the city. Like, I just wanted to live like above the coffee shop and Friends. Like, that just sounded great. I don't know. Like, I grew up watching that show. That's kind of how I honestly like visioned my life, was living in this cool, like, apartment in Manhattan that just looked like the fun life. And so hanging out with all my buddies. And so that's what I wanted to do. And Paige grew up in the Midwest and like remodeled houses with her parents. And her dream was to have like a big kitchen and a garden and a yard and to throw house parties and play cornhole. And I'm like, what? Like cornhole? There's just like two different visions for what the good life is. And so you have two different ways that you can negotiate that. I can just moralize her vision of the good life and tell her how stupid and ridiculous and how unpleasant that sounds. And cornhole, really, it's such a silly game. Why do you need all that space? Suburbs are all these cookie cutter houses living next to each other. How boring. I don't want to just be this like docile, like, like, I don't know, man in a polo pulling up to his suburb house.
Go for the throat. Jeez.
No, I didn't say that. I'm just saying, like, if I were trying to be as vicious as I could, that's what I'd say. And or I could actually engage with her kindly and be like, okay, tell me why this vision of the good life is so important to you. Tell me about the experiences that you had growing up that imparted this high value of the way our lives could look like here, and taking that genuinely and with curiosity and with openness and kindness, and then her doing the same for me. And so then we're going to negotiate on one level or another how our lives actually look like. But if I came at her harshly like that, then she would just feel like, okay, I can't bring up my desire to Matthias about a house. He'll get hostile and make me feel terrible. And really what happens in those situations is whoever's maybe the best at like verbal sparring, or whoever's the most disagreeable on a personality temperament level, typically wins the argument, quote unquote, because they can think faster. But that doesn't mean they're right. That just means, like, I don't know, they're quicker with whipping up words together that make the other person kind of like, kind of stumble. And so that's what happens. And then you feel like you have to segment off this whole opinion of yours from the other person. The other person doesn't like Chinese food. Every time I suggest Chinese food, they get mad at me. They talk about how gross it is. How could I like that? I'm never going to bring up Chinese food again. I guess I'm just not going to eat Chinese food with this person. And then that leaves you far apart and leading like you can't trust. And that happens over and over and over in every domain of life. And then that's where we get this experience of growing apart from our partner over the course of 7, 9, 10 years, is like, you tried to negotiate these different domains when the infatuation wore off, and thank God it did, because you needed to negotiate these things. But the way that you negotiated resulted in you segmenting off and hiding from each other emotionally and hiding your desires, because when you presented them, you were either responded to with hostility or condescension or shutting down or withdrawal or what have you. So the alternative to that would be to hear the other person, understand the experiences. And when you understand why something is really important to somebody, it typically produces warmth in your heart. Like, I don't know, like when I see my favorite author talk about a new book that he's reading that I may have not had previous interest before, but I respect that author, and so then I'm going to go buy that new book, even if it's on a topic that I may have not picked out myself in the bookstore, because the rapport I have with that author, leads me to taking a heightened interest in the thing that was previously irrelevant to me or whatever. The same thing happens in greater degree in a relationship. Like when you see the reason that someone is really attracted to the good life, the way that they want to live their life, and you have love towards that person, it's going to heighten your interest towards that thing. And your life is actually enriched, because now you don't just have all the experiences and all the desires and all the dreams that you have. You have two sets of all these great dreams and two sets of these incredible life experiences that you could merge together in this really creative, wonderful way. And I think for me, to use the house example, go back to that house example, it was like, I kind of learned that living in a house is kind of nice. And I have a drum set up downstairs, and I couldn't play drums in my like apartment in Manhattan, and I love playing drums. Like I can have like a big group of like 10 dudes over and have like a steak night and hang out around the barbecue. And sure, I can invite those same 10 people out to a restaurant, but it's different. It's a different kind of social experience. That's kind of nice. And I didn't really give it the credit that I thought, it deserved at the moment. And so anyway, the infatuation dies down. It gives you an opportunity to negotiate. And that's where the real bond actually comes. Because when you can negotiate what these different experiences, and then every time you do that, it actually builds trust, it builds intimacy, because you feel accepted and loved and listened to by your partner on the convergences of your personalities and your experiences. And then you build this really dynamic and complex and exciting life together that is constantly surprising you, because you're getting the fruits of trees that you would have never thought to plant. That's a really fun, awesome relationship. It's really cool. And that's actually, so I think people get worried when the infatuation dies down, like, oh my gosh, like now I'm worried to get married because, the sex is great right now, or the relationship's really great right now, but people who get married, then we're going to have kids, and then we're going to be really far apart, and we're going to be like just roommates. Like, no. All that happens when you fail negotiating. All that happens when you segment off your experience from the other person because you can't negotiate. So there's a lot of maybe wisdom and learning how to negotiate, talk about the things that are really important to you, share your experiences, doing that in an empathetic and kind way to your partner, because that's the good life. That's the good stuff, is when you're bonded and you're having sex when you're like 65 and wrinkly and saggy, and it's the best sex of your life.
Yeah.
That's the stuff, because you're having it with your best friend, and you're having it with someone that you have grandkids with, and you're having it with someone that is like knows you through and through. Like you don't know where you start and they end. You're that close. That's so much. That's what you're sacrificing for. Like that's what, when you're having these peripheral conversations about sexuality when you're dating, and you're like, oh, should we like take our shirts off? That'd be fun. No, like what do I do it not? It's like what you're trying to do is you're trying to get to that. It's like you're trying to build a world. You're trying to put in strategies so that you can get to the good life. Yeah. You can get to like the bonded, rich, full, like dynamic, erotic, pleasurable, exciting connection to someone that's made in the image of God and brings out that image in you. And it's worth sacrificing for, not just in this stoic purity way, but in like a very pragmatic, practical way. It's just worth it, or at least it has the potential to be worth it. That's not the guarantee. Not all of us arrive there. Like I said, the negotiation is imperative. But doesn't that kind of like make your heart leap up a little bit? Like, wouldn't that be great? Like, doesn't that inspire your hope just a little? That maybe we could have something like that, and that would be my life. Like, how cool. I get emotional thinking about it, because I think that's why we're on this podcast. That's why we're talking about this. That's why we're here. That's why we're navigating these complex social conversations around sexuality, is because we're trying to get people to that. Like, we're trying to get people to be so bonded and so close that it just fills up your life with everything good and beautiful. So, all right, tangent over. That's my soapbox.
Yeah.
Matthias, I love that story that you ended on, just the why and what could come out of it. And as 65-year-olds, if we keep our perspective big and we dig deep, I think that was beautiful. And you said you were being moved to tears as well. I'm like, my heart was racing too. I love that. I thought that was a beautiful picture and a beautiful way to wrap up our conversation. You brought a lot of wisdom, a lot of perspective from all the different things you see, both as a trained therapist and the perspectives you bring of your clients to the table. I thought it was awesome to have you today, get to know you a little bit. So I appreciate you taking the time to be with us.
That's so kind. Thanks for saying that. I'm thankful that you guys brought me in. These are conversations that are really important to me, and I think really important for the future of the church. And it's hard to navigate these conversations and these topics. You're risking upsetting a lot of people because these things matter. They touch the deepest parts of our experience and our traumas and our hurts and our dreams and our desires. Like that's why these conversations can feel contentious or make us nervous, is because they're just attached to the meaningful things. So I think what you guys are doing is really courageous and exploring these topics and really trying to open up these conversations. I think that it's going to be it's going to be a road filled with challenges and criticism, but I think that's why it takes courage. So keep going, guys. It's awesome.
Thank you.
This podcast was brought to you by the wonderful people at Project 619.